In order to prove that we're as tough as the other guy, we then use their language and we talk about things in their terms. And did we or did we not approve the latest weapons system? And did we or did we not ensure that the Pentagon budget remained stable or went up? And, it is a very old school approach to what constitutes security. And I think in the 21st century, with a different set of threats and perhaps people being more aware now of what those threats are, it provides a real opportunity for progressives to present a different definition of security.
That's the voice of Jeremy Ben-Ami, president of J Street. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. But first, here are your co-hosts, Joe Cirincione and Michelle Dover.
Welcome back to Press the Button. We hope you had a safe and socially distant Memorial Day weekend. And thanks for being with us today for our 59th episode, our 11th week of sheltering in place. And for me, that means I'm in my basement bunker outside Washington, D.C.
And I am coming to you from a closet in New Haven, Connecticut.
What do you have for us today, Michelle?
Well, today's early warning starts with the news about the Trump administration's announcement that it will pull the U.S. out of the Open Skies Treaty. And we ask, why is that treaty important? And what other treaty members should be doing to preserve it. We also discuss an upcoming report on the results of the first year's worth of actions by the Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy Network.
Yay!
Which now counts leaders of over 50 organizations, including our very own Joe Cirincione.
We are the champions.
But no, it's good news. So you're going to have to listen in.
It's a great organization. It's one of the things I'm most proud of that we've done over the last few years is help start the Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy. I hope you'll check them out. What's the website for them, by the way?
gcnuclearpolicy.org.
Thank you very much. Our interview today is with Jeremy Ben-Ami. He is one of the most successful social entrepreneurs I have ever met. Jeremy is the president of J Street, the pro-Israel, pro-peace nationwide organization. Jeremy's connection with Israel goes way back, over 100 years, in fact, because his family was one of the founding members of Tel Aviv. He served as domestic policy advisor in the Clinton White House. He was a national policy advisor for Howard Dean's presidential campaign. And I didn't know this until we talked. Jeremy himself ran for mayor of New York in the early 2000s. He's been listed as one of the top 50 most influential Jewish Americans by The Forward, a very prestigious Jewish American newspaper. We talked about Bibi Netanyahu's plot to annex large portions of the occupied West Bank, the complete failure of Donald Trump's maximum pressure campaign against Iran. This is now 2 years after Trump began violating the successful international accord that largely ended the nuclear threat from Iran. And perhaps most important for many of you, we talk about organizing, something dear to my heart. In this time of unprecedented crisis, how can we as progressives and as activists best organize ourselves to impact policy? Can we build a broad coalition that links the climate crisis, social justice, healthcare, and other movements with the drive for a stronger national security strategy and a saner nuclear policy?
After the interview, you'll hear me ask Joe a question from one of our listeners in New York. Now, Joe, can you confirm that you do not see these questions in advance?
I try mightily to get them. I do not get them. I'm answering them blind. The first time I hear the question is when you say it.
But before we go into the rest of the episode, we wanted to remind you that Plowshares Fund's annual gala Chain Reaction is just 2 weeks away, June 8th, 2020. We are doing things differently this year.
Chain Reaction is our annual fundraiser. We've been doing it for 7 years now. Usually we charge about $250 for a ticket, but because of the pandemic, we're doing something different. We're opening the event to you, the public, for free. No contribution necessary. All you have to do is register. We'll send you the Zoom link. And on Monday, June 8th, if you're on the East Coast, it'll be 8 o'clock. If you're on the West Coast, it'll be 5. And you can join us for this amazing list of speakers that's growing every day. Who do we have so far, Michelle?
Some of the names include leader Nancy Pelosi, Governor Jerry Brown, and actor Michael Douglas. Just 3 of the fascinating guests that will be there to share their insights with you.
So please, I hope you can join us. Go to plowshares.org and register for Chain Reaction June 8th, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern.
And finally, leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you're listening to this podcast. If you're enjoying, press the button.
We're so glad to have you with us today. We got a lot to cover, and the clock is ticking.
And now, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Dal. Joining me today are two new guests to the podcast, Moritz Kütt, a senior researcher at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg, and Jack Brosnan, program officer at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Welcome to the show.
Welcome. Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you, Michelle.
The way this segment works is we have 7 minutes to discuss the week's nuclear news, and which is about the same amount of time the U.S. president would have to decide whether to launch nuclear weapons in response to an incoming strike. And our time starts now. Moritz, on Thursday, senior U.S. officials said the United States would pull out of the Open Skies Treaty in 6 months, saying Russia had repeatedly violated the treaty. The treaty, which entered into force in 2002, allows the 35 members to do surveillance flights over each other's territories to promote openness and transparency. But in the age of satellites, why does this treaty matter, and what does it mean for the U.S. to withdraw?
It's a very unfortunate decision by the U.S. officials to announce the withdrawal, and mainly because this is a true multilateral treaty. As you said, there's 35 member states, and they share overflights, and it brings together military officials from different countries that fly over another country, and even the country that is overflown can be on board of the aircraft. And so this builds trust in an enormous way. Also, the satellites that we have can only work if there's no clouds, while aircraft can fly under clouds. So there is some technical advantage of the treaty. And in addition, the images taken in these overflights can be shared with all member states and can be used kind of publicly, at least diplomatically, as everyone knows that these images were taken. Whereas if you use a national asset, a spy satellite, you can't really reveal this image in all cases.
So what should the other treaty members, which are primarily in Europe and Russia, do if they want to save the treaty?
So the other treaty members, first and foremost, of course, should remain members of this treaty. This treaty would actually work also without the United States, even if we should also call on the United States to remain in the treaty. The past has shown that the treaty, most of the flights in the treaty are overflights of Russia over Europe and Europe over Russia. The US only accounts for a very small fraction of these flights over Russia and Russian flights over the US. And it's actually the case that the US flies way more over Russia than Russia flies over the US. Other treaty members could point out this to the US, and they could also point out to the US that the Russian violations of the treaty are in no way such important so to actually withdraw from the treaty. They are true allegations, but at the same time, the treaty has way more benefits than just to withdraw from the treaty right now.
Moritz, you're the co-author of just this fantastic website on all things Open Skies Treaty. It's at openskies.flights. And if you haven't seen it yet, I encourage all of you listeners to go check it out. The analysis of the number of flights over which countries, I think, really helped me to see where the benefit was, especially for Europe and for Russia, and the relatively minor role that the U.S. plays in it. Do you have any hope that the European nations will continue to uphold the treaty?
So far, all the European countries have stated that they hope the US would remain in the treaty and that the treaty would stay as it is. We all hope that Russia will remain in the treaty. So far, we have seen no indications of Russian officials saying we would leave if the US would leave. So far, they most have said we will see when it comes to this point. And as the US only announced yesterday, we now have to see what Russia will do. We hope they will remain in the treaty.
Switching gears, Jack, this week, the Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy Initiative is releasing a report detailing how the first year of pledges went. For those who are not familiar with the effort, Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy is a leadership network that brings together the heads of organizations working in nuclear policy to commit to public pledges about how they will work to break down gender barriers in their spheres of influence. And at this point, the network has over 50 champions and organizations. These pledges include aiming to avoid appearing on single gender panels, as well as other pledges of the champion's own choosing. So as the report's lead author, can you tell us what the top takeaways of the report are?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Michelle. It's been wonderful to have the opportunity to work on these issues. As you know, the whole idea of Gender Champions was based on similar leadership networks, but ultimately it was an experiment. What this report demonstrated through tracking of commitments and really honing in on rigorous use of data was that our hypothesis and experimental process brought the results that we wanted. Voluntary commitments have created positive results in advancing the goal of making gender equality a working reality in the nuclear policy community. But I think it's also really important to remember, and I want to emphasize, how much high-level buy-in there's been on this process. As one of the first gender champions, Secretary Ernest Moniz, CEO and co-chairman of NTI, has shown amazing leadership on these issues, and many other leaders are following suit.
What surprised you as you conducted this research and in the data?
Well, I'd say again that early high-level buy-in has been fundamental to the success of this process. I've been really pleasantly surprised by the rapid growth of our network and just how leaders have leaned into the process. But I've also been surprised by just how effective voluntary commitments with a public accountability mechanism have been. Defining specific goals has allowed our gender champions to make impressive progress in promoting diversity. You'll have to wait for the upcoming launch of the report for the detailed results, but suffice it to say that the data we've gathered supports our hypothesis.
And full disclosure, Jack and I will be a part of a launch event this Thursday, May 28th, where we will join Ambassador Laura Holgate, Plowshares Fund President Joe Cirincione, and Secretary Ernie Moniz to discuss the report's findings and what they mean for the field. In the meantime, Jack, when will the report become public, and where can people go to read it or register for the event?
The report will be live on Thursday, May 28th, same day as our launch event. You can go to gcnuclearpolicy.org to see the report, sign up to receive emails from us, and to register for the launch webinar. You can also find us on Twitter at gcnuclearpolicy.
And with that, our 7 minutes are up. Moritz, Jack, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Michelle.
This year, the Plowshares Fund Chain Reaction Gala is going virtual, and you're invited. Join us Monday, June 8, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern, live on Zoom. Chain Reaction Securing Our Future features a keynote panel by the Science and Security Board of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, as well as an interview with former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, special messages from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, actor and UN Messenger of Peace Michael Douglas, a video from the Bomb Squad, and much more. Registration is free. For more information, visit plowshares.org/chainreaction2020.
I'm Joe Cirincione, and it's a pleasure to sit down virtually with Jeremy Benamy, the leader of J Street. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Joe. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
I want to start with Israel and what's happening right now in Israel, expand out to the region as a whole, including Iran, and then end back here at home and your vision of how like-minded organizations can better work together to create an America and the world that is safer, more peaceful, and more just. But before we get into any of that, could you please tell us a little bit about J Street? What is it and what do you do?
Great. Well, J Street is a American-based lobby that is focused primarily on the U.S.-Israel relationship. And we're grounded in the principles that we support the state of Israel. We believe Palestinians should have their state as well. Therefore, in order to end the long-running conflict between the two, we think there should be a two-state negotiated resolution between the two parties. We are trying to redefine in the United States what it means to be pro-Israel, and for too long it's meant simply going along and getting along with the government of Israel, and we think you can be critical of Israeli government policies and still be pro-Israel. We want to see a much more open conversation in the United States about issues related to Israel. Sometimes that conversation gets overtaken by the extremes, and we want a more open, rational, and considered dialogue on these issues. And we want to pursue peace and justice because those are the values on which Jewish Americans were raised. And the state of the Jewish people in Israel should be a state that upholds the highest of those values. And our agenda is to try to help move Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict along the road towards peace and justice, which is where we believe it should go.
And could you tell us how long you've been around and how large you are now?
We started in 2008, so it's about 12 years now.
Oh,
and
that's when I started with Plowshares Fund. We're on parallel tracks.
And I'm back in my basement now because of the lockdown and coronavirus. But we started as
me too. My basement. I'm looking at you on Zoom, and your basement looks a lot like mine.
And we're a basement startup, and we grew from there with 4 staff and very little money. We grew to a $10 million a year organization and 70 staff and 6 offices. And, I think we've become a respected voice in the dialogue in the United States when it comes to policy towards Israel, when it comes towards American relations with the Middle East as a whole, and particularly in the political debate, proving to people running for office that in order to find political support in the American Jewish community, you don't have to be the most hawkish person on the stage. That actually the American Jewish community is pretty moderate on these issues and believes in 2 states and diplomacy and peace, and you can find political support by pursuing those ends as opposed to the most militant possible line.
I agree with you. My family's Jewish. My children are Jewish. My grandchildren are Jewish. I'm a supporter of J Street. I'm pro-Israel, pro-peace. And I'm just in awe of what you've been able to do with this organization. Where do people go if they want to find out more about J Street, and how can they join?
Well, we're online at jstreet.org, the letter J and the word street.org as our website. We have Twitter and Facebook followings and a very, very active social media presence. So at jstreet.org is our Twitter handle, all written out, and jstreet.org on the web.
And one of the things my family is concerned about, including my family in Israel, is annexation and the drive right now by Bibi Netanyahu, the still Prime Minister of Israel, to actually physically take over very large swaths of the West Bank. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, look, annexation is the issue of the moment. It's really a very real policy and political debate that's going to take place in the next 6 weeks. The larger question at stake is 2 different visions of what the state of Israel can and ultimately should be. One vision, which is the right of center vision that Bibi Netanyahu is the leader of at the moment, but has been around for almost 100 years in the debate within the Jewish community and within the Zionist movement. It's a belief that Israel needs to be as large and strong as possible, that it's always going to be fighting with its neighbors and it has to win, and that it's a zero-sum conflict. And in order to survive, you need to be as big a country and as strong a country as possible. The other vision is a much more progressive and liberal vision. I think it's more in line with the founders of the State of Israel. It's in line with people like currently in the debate, people, let's say, like Yair Lapid or Ehud Barak, Ehud Olmert. It was the vision of Yitzhak Rabin. And that's that you need to find a way to get along with your neighbors and resolve these conflicts and end the bloodshed and end the violence. And annexation is an effort by the right of center to win this argument and to say, no, we won this territory of the West Bank over the Green Line in 1967, and we're going to keep it forever. It's ours, and we won it, and that's the way that Israel and the Jewish people will be best and strongest. And those of us who believe in a win-win approach that should try to find peace and resolution with the neighbors are very concerned that annexation means the end of the ability of the state of Israel to be both Jewish in nature and also democratic, because a minority of Jewish people between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea will be the only political power ruling over a majority of non-Jews, of Palestinians who live in the same land.
Spell that out a little more for me. They can't be both Jewish and free, meaning that in order to maintain that rule, the Jewish state of Israel will have to enforce what?
Well, there are roughly 13.5 to 14 million people who live between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. That land was the British mandate after World War I. It's considered to be mandatory Palestine. It's considered to be Greater Israel. However you look at it from whichever lens, that land has nearly 14 million people in it. Mm-hmm. And more than half of the people that live there are not Jewish. If the only state, if the only political power in that area is the state of Israel, and the only people who have the rights in the state of Israel to vote and to actually control what goes on are the Jewish people, then you have a minority of Jewish people exercising political power over a majority of non-Jewish people. And that's where you're headed if you only have one state. In order to avoid that, in order to avoid having to choose between having a democracy or not and having a Jewish majority or not, the only way forward for the state of Israel is to have a division, a physical division in the land, so that there's a state for the Palestinian people living side by side in peace and security with the state that is the national homeland of the Jewish people in the state of Israel.
And where do you think this annexation is going to go between now and the elections?
Well, the right wing in Israel believes they are in the midst of a historic window of opportunity, that this moment provides them with the chance to do what they've wanted to do for 50 plus years, which is to seize and take the land that they won in 1967. Because of Donald Trump, because of Trump's quote unquote vision for peace that he issued in February, he is essentially giving a green light to the state of Israel to annex and control a good sized chunk of that land over the Green Line that was occupied for the last 53 years. And this moment is a brief moment. If Trump loses in November and Biden comes in January, the United States will not give the green light, will take away that approval. So you have a 6-month window of opportunity for the right wing to annex. And I don't think they're going to want to miss that opportunity. I think Bibi and Ambassador David Friedman, the American ambassador, who I often call the settler ambassador to the United States rather than the U.S. ambassador to Israel, I believe that they are going to try to seize this opportunity right after July 1.
And how do you know Joe Biden wouldn't let them do that?
He's been very clear, and his on-the-record remarks, not just this year, but in other years, his opposition. I think he just had an event, a quote-unquote fireside chat with the Jewish community this past week, in which he reiterated his unequivocal opposition to this kind of a move. And he and his aides have also reiterated that many times over the past few weeks. The reason this is so relevant is because of the new Israeli government, which has a coalition agreement. And in that coalition agreement is a specific green light for the Israeli government to annex after July 1 with U.S. approval. It's right there in black and white in the coalition agreement that Israel will only move forward with annexation if it has U.S. approval. And it has that from the Trump administration. It would not have that from a Biden administration. So that's why there's this brief window of opportunity starting July 1, which is the date in the coalition agreement. And even this week, Ron Dermer, who's the Israeli ambassador to Washington, is quoted as being in senators' offices and meeting with other Republican Party leadership, saying to them that Israel intends to annex come July 1.
Wow. Okay, so this is at the top of your agenda. One of the other issues that's always been at the top for years now has been Iran. Both because of the threat that it poses, the potential threat at least to the state of Israel, but also about the potential for resolving that threat, for lessening that threat, for containing that threat. And we work together to help support the efforts to get a diplomatic solution to the Iran nuclear program. This was culminated in the Iran deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. 2 years ago this month, Donald Trump pulled out of that deal, or more precisely, he started violating it. He reimposed sanctions on Iran. He began his policy of maximum pressure on Iran. 2 years out, how's that policy working? Where are we?
Well, sadly, I think that we are closer to Iran having a nuclear weapon than we probably were even in the later stages right before the JCPOA was implemented. Iran has ramped its program right back up to where it was practically. The chances of re-engaging diplomacy are going to be slim, given the lack of trust in the United States and the failure of American leadership on the diplomatic front. And so I think we as a world, the Middle East as a region, Israel as a country, the people in the Middle East are a lot worse off today, much closer to the brink of open conflict with Iran, much closer to having another nuclear power in the region and potentially send the region, as you know, into a nuclear arms race. These are terrible consequences of a policy choice that has taken us away from diplomacy and away from containment of a nuclear threat to egging it on and making it 10 times worse.
Any resolution in sight? Is there any chance that Mike Pompeo can get us a better deal that the president has long promised?
Well, I don't think that anybody, that you and I work with and know, thinks that there's any chance of serious diplomacy between now and the end of the first term of Trump. If the Democrats win in November and Joe Biden takes over on January 20th of 2021, I think there will be a window for renewed diplomacy, for America's re-entry into the JCPOA, for it to come into compliance, for then Iran to take steps to move towards coming back into compliance. And I hope then renewed diplomacy from there. I think there is that opportunity in that window. If Trump is reelected, I don't see any chance that the Iranian regime is going to, in the months leading up to its own elections, see any interest in renewing diplomacy. So I don't see any path under this president or under Mike Pompeo that diplomacy is the route that we end up going down. I think it only happens if you get a change here in November.
But even if we get that change, there's going to be enormous pressure just to start repairing the damage that this administration has done. And it's unclear what kind of national security policy the new administration would have. And one of the influences on that will be what the organizations like J Street and what you personally do. I'd like to hear a little more about what your vision is for the path forward, for where we go from here, for how organizations like Plowshares and J Street and many of the other progressive organizations out there can better work together to make sure we complete what many people are urging us to do, a redefinition of national security, a rethinking of what our priorities are in this country to keep America safe, to stabilize the world.
Well, this is such an important question and a really, really big conversation, Joe. And, I think that the 21st century provides such different and enormous challenges from what you and I and many others obviously experienced in the 20th century. The types of threats that are out there to humanity, which are much more global and non-national in nature, whether it is proven by the current coronavirus pandemic and the public health challenges, whether it relates to climate, whether it relates to the threats that are posed by extra-national organizations that pursue a nuclear agenda, for instance, and pursue other forms of threat to carry out their agendas. These are threats that transcend any one country's ability to deal with them. And they're very, very serious threats to the security of people, which always comes down to be the number one responsibility of any government, is to protect people and provide safety and security. And I think for progressives and for the Democratic Party, we have had a real challenge in how we approach security and defense and questions related to our national security policy. We are often on defense. We're trying to prove that we are as tough as the Republicans, as tough as the right-wingers, and we can be strong. And somehow we have tended to fall, I think, into a trap in that we in order to prove that we're as tough as the other guy, we then use their language and we talk about things in their terms. And did we or did we not approve the latest weapons system? And then did we or did we not ensure that the Pentagon budget remained stable or went up? And, it is a very old school approach to what constitutes security. And I think in the 21st century, with a different set of threats and perhaps people being more aware now of what those threats are, it provides a real opportunity for progressives to present a different definition of security. I don't think that progressives and Democrats want to cut the commitment that our party and our country and our world are making to keeping people secure. But when we invest that money in nuclear weapons, when we invest that in the military-industrial complex, when we are arming ourselves to the teeth, we're actually making ourselves less secure. These are not steps that actually make individuals feel more secure. And we have to come up with a overarching message and an overarching platform that says that progressives and the Democrats and folks who are arguing for a complete reshaping of our national security policy actually have a better way to keep people safe and secure. We have a better way of dealing with the threats that are going to face us in the decades ahead in the 21st century. And we need to invest. We need to increase the amount of resources we are putting into addressing the climate, into addressing public health, into helping the poorest in the world to ensure that they have an economic path forward, so that the unrest that will come without food and without economic security, that unrest is going to affect us. And we need to invest in those countries and in those communities and societies so that we stem that. And those are things that will make us secure. We have to redefine what constitutes the defense budget, what constitutes a national security budget. And we need a new language and we need a new messaging strategy. And I think that so many different groups, and you and I have discussed this, whether they work on climate or public health or food or nuclear weapons or even on Middle East peace, that we can all come together under a shared umbrella with a shared set of language about how do we reshape the national security policy of the United States in the 21st century to adjust to this new world that we're living in.
Yeah. Well, I'm dead serious about this, as you are, I know, and others are. And I recognize that step one is to have that vision and to have that kind of reconceptualization. And we need a lot of work just on that all by itself. But then step two is adopting the right organizational structure to try to implement that vision. And I worry that we don't have that yet. That what we have is a lot of very well-meaning groups, some large and extremely effective, like J Street, and a lot of others, smaller, working on the margins. And we're just not powerful enough to overcome the entrenched interests. Because after all, this, so much of what policy is determined by the lobbyists in this town, by the moneyed interest in this town. And if you want to threaten a $750 billion defense budget, man, you better have something more powerful than an op-ed to go after that. So I'm searching, and I'm looking. What do you think the organizational forms might be, or the kinds of things we should be exploring?
Well, first thing I'd say is that not one organization can address all aspects of the problem. And I think what we need is a more of a campaign approach. We do need the thinking and the thought and the intellectual capital. We do need the people power that will actually lobby and get people out to vote and make sure that we're getting the right people in the right offices to make the right decisions. And we need messaging and we need communications vehicles. And there's just a wide range of different tactical arms to this kind of a campaign. And so I think that, it isn't necessarily going to be one organization that solves this, but I think we need an integrated campaign that brings together different people's strengths and different organizations' strengths behind this common goal. And I think the thing that encourages me the most is the way that politics has shifted over the last 2 decades in terms of money. I was involved in the Howard Dean campaign in 2003 and 2004, and it then, a lot of the techniques and ways in which they raised money at the grassroots level led into the Obama campaign, and they've sort of made their way into Sanders and Warren and other progressive campaigns, where large numbers of small donors are actually able to begin to counter the influence of large dollar lobbyists and influencers. And I think that the move on style, the grassroots style of bringing together large numbers of people who individually didn't have the power to stand up to the large lobbies and the large organizations, but together actually can raise significant amounts of money and wield significant power, that's something that's become available in these last 15 to 20 years. And I think that that's a game changer and needs to be harnessed for this issue as well.
Okay, so what do you think of this? One of my ideas is that those of us who want to change U.S. nuclear policy are not strong enough to do it. Like, even if we got all our groups together, the way we did during the Iran campaign, that's still not enough. You can help support an administration objective. If you have an administration pushing for something like Iran or a New START, you could help them get the ball over the goal line, right? But to do something big like this, to move billions of dollars out of the Pentagon and over to healthcare, you need a bigger coalition. Well, there are bigger organizations working out there on climate change, for example. And what we can say to the Green New Deal people is, where are you going to get the money for that? Well, we got this $750 billion defense budget. We have this $2 trillion nuclear modernization budget. Adopt our cause and you can help get some of that money. So that's the kind of coalition you might need, where you have the climate change groups, the healthcare groups, the gun control groups, and others. As we were talking to Leilani Munter just a couple of weeks ago, those people who are concerned about habitat change, there's lots of environmental groups. If there was some way to get them together on a shared set of strategic objectives that would support this transformation, I haven't seen anything like that in my career. I haven't seen anything that big, but this is a pretty big moment. I haven't seen anything like this before either. Whereas David Rothkopf told us last week, we have these three crises: a pandemic, an economic collapse, and a completely incompetent and corrupt administration. So if there's any moment where such a coalition might be possible, it's now. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd add on to that we now have the toolkit that wasn't there. The reason why you never saw anything like this is we didn't have the ability to communicate and mobilize mass numbers of people so easily. The internet and the changes that have happened over the last 10, 20 years now allow us to gather and mobilize and put into use political power in a way that just wasn't possible. You needed to do it in person. You needed boots and shoe leather and to go door to door and phone calls. Now, with a push of a button, you can communicate with millions of people in a second. And this changes everything. And there's no cost to it. You don't have to purchase TV time or radio time in order to do it. So the toolkit is there to do things in a way that was never possible before. Thankfully, because we're now in a moment when we're facing threats that we've never seen before. And so maybe the tools can match the moment. We need a message and we need a shared vision that brings us together. So we're sort of all pushing in the same general direction rather than pulling at each other. But the toolkit, I think, is there for us to be able to do it.
Well, Jeremy, I don't know if this coalition is going to be possible, but I know that if we don't start talking about it, it won't happen. And I want to thank you very much for taking some of your time. I know how busy you are, to share some of your insights, your organizing strategy, and your recommendations with us today.
Well, thanks, Joe. And you know how much I appreciate you and Plowshares and everything you did to bring a really effective coalition together to support the Iran nuclear agreement. And it was historic, still is unbelievably important. And we, I think, have a chance to rescue it with a good outcome in November.
Thank you, my friend. Enjoy the rest of your day.
All right. Thanks, Joe.
We get letters. We get stacks and stacks of letters.
And now, the segment where I ask Joe a question that he's never seen before. Joe, are you ready for this?
I'm ready. Let's go, Michelle.
Today's question comes from Paul in New York, who asks, can you explain what a peaceful nuclear explosion is?
Ooh, excellent question. We don't do these anymore. But you have to remember that very soon after the nuclear bomb was invented 75 years ago, people really thought this was not just the wonder weapon for the future, but that this was the wonder energy source for the future, that we could use it for all kinds of things. In the 1950s, you had witnesses parading up to Capitol Hill talking about atomic airplanes, atomic cars. I recently saw a sketch of an atomic pickup truck. A very small nuclear reactor would be in the back. It was said that nuclear energy would make electricity so cheap we wouldn't have to meter it anymore. They thought it was going to be used for everything, including demolition. That you could use nuclear explosions to dig canals, to dig mines, to dig reservoirs. The Soviets used a nuclear explosion to dig a reservoir in an area of Siberia that is now a very large radioactive lake. So, it's kind of unbelievable. This went on for quite some time. And so some states, either because they really believed it or they were using it as an excuse, started to talk about peaceful nuclear explosion. So not a weapon, but something you would use for these kinds of construction techniques. India, as a matter of fact, in 1974 did a test of what they called a PNE, a peaceful nuclear explosion. Now, the United States kind of hemmed and hawed about this and didn't actually call it a weapons test, even though in my view it clearly was. And we don't actually register India, or for that matter Pakistan, as testing a nuclear weapon until they actually conducted weapons tests in 1998. But these PNEs, as they were called, were the rage for a while. But by the end of the 70s, it had largely died out. People realized you couldn't dig anything useful with these. You couldn't use this because of the obvious radioactivity and the fairly uncontrollable nature of the explosions. So PNEs, along with atomic pickup trucks, are a thing of the past.
Thankfully. Another week, another question. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, Alex Spire, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.